For almost 3 years now, Japan has been shut to the outside world. Instead of thousands of visitors enjoying the sights, there are hardly any paying guests. But that's all set to change on October the 11th, when Japan will drop all restrictions on foreign tourists. It's a glimmer of hope for tour guides and hotel owners. Welcome to the COVID-19 special. We'll also be visiting the United States, where the pandemic has led to a rise in obesity among children. But first, China. Right before the 20th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, many Chinese are angry about the country's restrictive zero-COVID policy, which is wreaking havoc on the Chinese economy, including the tourism industry.
Passenger numbers here paint a gloomy picture of domestic travel. And this flight's headed to one of China's top tourist destinations. Upon arrival, passengers are greeted with the familiar sight of people dressed in hazmat suits standing by to swab them. This is the city of Yan'an in northern Shanxi province. It's famed for being a wartime stronghold for the communists during the Chinese Civil War, a must-visit for party faithfuls. But its status as a red tourism hotspot hasn't shielded it from the effects of COVID-19 travel curbs. Nan Lingshuang is a folk singer and, like many people from Yan'an, relies on tourists to make ends meet.
Visitors from all over the country have declined, so our income has also fallen. Especially for artists like us, life is very hard.
The singer says she hopes visitor numbers pick up over China's National Golden Week holidays. It's a peak 7-day holiday period, marking the founding of modern-day China. But the pandemic has hit hard over the last few years. Local resident Wang Zihua said it was hard not to notice the change.
3 years ago, tons of people came here from around the country and even from abroad to see this historic site. Since the pandemic, traffic has decreased. Tourists don't like to wear masks, and they don't like the idea of not being able to go home if there's a lockdown.
Ahead of the Communist Party Congress, authorities are tightening restrictions even further. And President Xi, who's expected to secure a precedent-breaking third term, has doubled down on China's zero-COVID approach to ensure stability. Despite warnings against anyone who questions the restrictions, there are plenty of signs of people cracking. This COVID testing booth was spotted recently, sprayed with graffiti, saying, "Give me freedom or give me death." In this video circulating on Chinese social media, a man jumps up angrily when security tell him to mask up, while he's sitting alone in his own restaurant. Joe Mazur from research firm Trivium China says people looking for a quick relaxation of COVID curbs after the party congress are likely to be disappointed.
The main concern here is about medical resources, right? The government is very concerned that if it were to abandon COVID zero, you would suddenly have an overwhelming of hospitals, not enough medical resources to go around. What we may see is after Xi is firmly ensconced in his third term, and once sort of the political aspect has sort of been squared away, there may be some additional room for policy experimentation, first on a small scale, and then if it proves successful, on a larger scale.
It couldn't come soon enough for places like Yan'an. Nationwide, tourism fell by 28% in the first half of this year, according to China's tourism ministry. Many people's livelihoods here depend on a turnaround, sooner rather than later.
Is China's strategy the way to go, or is it better to relax the rules in spite of high case numbers? Many countries in Europe got through the summer COVID-19 wave relatively unscathed. DW reporter Alexa Meyer spoke with epidemiologist Viola Priesemann from the Max Planck Institute for Dynamics and Self-Organization and asked her how we can protect ourselves this fall.
Ms. Priesemann, you monitored the summer wave very closely. What did you observe and what conclusions did you come to?
One of the relatively clear results is that the summer wave looked similar across many different European countries, and that it receded without any significant change in behavior. In other words, it went away on its own due to increasing immunity among the population.
How were you able to determine that? Based on case numbers, hospitalizations?
Both the number of infections and hospitalizations. Those are the most meaningful figures now, along with mobility data and various surveys. There's a range of data to draw on. We still don't have the perfect data set here in Germany. For example, we don't know exactly how many unreported cases there are because there's no representative surveillance in Germany. But based on various indicators, we can assume an unreported case number of between factor 2 and 5. That is 2 to 5 times the number of reported cases.
Are we still in a pandemic, or has COVID become endemic?
You can't really pinpoint a day when a pandemic ends and a virus becomes endemic, but one of the criteria is clear, that the wave recedes without having to introduce any big restrictions or changes in behavior.
What conclusions have you been able to draw for the fall and winter with regard to a possible new wave?
There are various scenarios for the fall and winter. The first and most optimistic scenario is that the current Omicron variant won't be replaced by a new one. We're assuming that there's a large number of people who, to their knowledge, haven't had COVID. Studies have shown that's a surprisingly high number of between 40 to 60% of the population. I'd say by now it's more likely to be 40%. People are surprised by that because of how many people they know who've had it. But there are a lot of people who are older or who've had to protect themselves more for health reasons. It's a large percentage, and many of these people have successfully avoided the virus. There are many reasons for that. Because of the measures that have been in place, people know how to protect themselves. And these people are often part of a larger bubble of people who are taking precautions, trying to avoid infection, or avoid the risk of passing on an infection. People who took precautions, who tried to avoid infection, there's a fair number who've managed that.
Based on your research, what would you recommend? A fourth vaccination or specifically a booster shot adapted for Omicron?
I get a lot of questions about the vaccines and new variants, but I have to take a pass on that. I'm an epidemiologist, so I look at the spread of the disease. It's better when we all stay in our lane and only comment on areas in which we're an expert. Otherwise, it leads to a lot of misunderstandings. I'm happy when virologists don't get mixed up in epidemiology and vice versa.
We're hearing reports about new subvariants of the Omicron virus in circulation. What can you tell us about that? What have you observed?
We don't know which of the future scenarios is most likely in terms of new variants. It's possible that we'll still be dealing with the current Omicron variant, in which case we don't think that the winter wave will be much worse than the one we saw in summer. People will get infected because not everyone has been infected, or because their immunity is slowly wearing off. That's one factor we still don't know a lot about. So we might see a lot of people calling in sick to work. That raises the question, should we continue to mandate that infected people remain in isolation for a set amount of time? That's an important discussion, because isolation isn't simply a restriction. It also gives people a way to protect themselves against infection. And so it's also a way for employers to ensure that an outbreak doesn't immediately infect the entire team, but that the impact can be a bit more spread out over the winter.
Viola Priesemann, thank you for speaking with us.
Thank you.
In the United States, pandemic lockdowns meant many children weren't getting enough exercise, contributing to a nationwide problem with childhood obesity. Now, doctors in cities like New York are seeing the consequences and sounding the alarm.
Kevin can finally get back on the basketball court. It's where he spent most of his time before the COVID pandemic.
Before the pandemic hit, it was just simple, go outside, do activities like shoot around, stuff like that, hang out with friends, play ball with friends, like these kids right here, and yeah, stuff like that.
But from one day to the next, everything changed. Schools and sports facilities were closed during the lockdown. Even the basket hoops were removed so that no one could play here.
For me, it was brutal because, like I said, I didn't really know. All I know was like play ball, stay fit. But like my knowledge on like activities was low, so I was miserable in the house. I was home alone most of the time. My mom was at work, 16-hour shifts. It's a little boring though. The only thing I really had, only company I had was my dog at the time, books, and games.
Kevin's mother, Miracle, is a single parent. She works at a nearby hospital. During the pandemic, she had little time to look after her son. She was shocked to see how lonely he was and even how his body had changed.
The hardest part of the pandemic was seeing my son when I would come home in the same spot I left him. He started snacking more. Of course, you're sitting home, you're watching television, there's nothing to do, you can't go out. Started eating unhealthy, put on a few pounds. You started seeing the weight gain. I'm probably responsible for some of his weight too because I was too exhausted to cook healthy meals. I was too exhausted to stand on lines to wait for, to go inside of a grocery store and, I was just exhausted.
During the pandemic, the proportion of overweight children rose dramatically, particularly in poorer areas and among minorities in the U.S.
How are you? How are you?
Dr. Sarita Duper confirms this trend. She's a pediatric cardiologist in the Brooklyn borough of New York and specializes in the care of obese children.
Everything just got exaggerated during COVID, so the kids' weights went up. Kids were already very obese and they got much more obese. The kids who were pre-diabetic got diabetes. The rate of diabetes went up a lot in this community. The people had high blood pressure, people had high cholesterol, and people became totally deconditioned. They were not doing any exercise at all.
Sarita Duper is trying to turn things around. Years ago, she founded the organization Live Light, Live Right. The group offers fitness and nutrition courses to children and parents. During the pandemic, the courses went online. But now, everyone's back outside on the field.
Come on, Isaac!
The doctor knows how dangerous obesity is for children.
If a 10-year-old child is 1.5 times his weight, all his organs are aging. He's not a normal 10-year-old. His body is like a 30, 40-year-old. His heart is very stiff. It's serious. I'm even seeing liver dysfunction. I'm seeing kids get fatty liver. Their kidneys are not functioning good. I've seen patients go into early heart failure.
Kevin has managed to get his weight under control, but he didn't do it alone.
Notice that
Online videos from a New York nonprofit called Active Plus taught him how to get back in shape through simple exercises.
It helped me a lot. It definitely expanded my knowledge on like different workouts to do instead of the push-ups, squats, sit-ups. Definitely did expand my knowledge and other stuff, like even cardio. Like I didn't know you could do cardio at home at the time.
For Kevin, his experience during the pandemic has made a real impact. He now wants to study kinesiology and sports medicine and teach others how to live healthy, eat right, and stay fit. He now knows firsthand how important it is and also how difficult it can sometimes be.
Do you have any questions about COVID-19? Our science correspondent Derek Williams is here to answer them. Just send your questions to covidproducer@dw.com. This week he answers the question, what makes a virus that infects animals turn into one that infects humans?
I'd say that this is largely dictated by two factors, evolution and opportunity. So let's look for a second at those two concepts. In biology, evolution is the process of change in inherited characteristics in a population over the course of time. Now, Viruses, strictly speaking, aren't alive since they can't replicate without a host. So evolution in them happens a little differently than in living organisms that can reproduce all on their own. First of all, it can happen a lot faster because during a viral infection, replication occurs at a really fast rate. And some viruses, like the ones that cause HIV or flu, they also have high rates of mutation, which means that they change constantly, allowing succeeding generations to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. And that includes adapting, for example, to make a successful jump from one species to another, like we think, for instance, SARS-CoV-2 adapted to jump from bats to us, maybe with a species in between. An ability to adapt quickly to new circumstances through evolution sort of automatically makes at least some viruses highly opportunistic. About 1 out of every 7 of the 1,400 or so known human pathogens is a virus, as opposed to a bacterium or a fungus or some other parasitic organism. Around a third of those, over 70 viruses in total, are viewed as what are called emerging or re-emerging pathogens. So viruses that have been able to make the jump from animals to us in the recent past, what we call zoonotic viruses. And all the evidence indicates that the number of emerging zoonotic diseases has climbed rapidly in the last few hundred years. That shouldn't come as a surprise. It's pretty squarely on us. We Homo sapiens are now found in pretty much every corner of the planet, no matter how remote. And our drive to exploit resources everywhere we go brings us into ever more contact with reservoirs of different virus in ever more places. Climate change and human destruction of natural habitats and intensive animal farming, they're all making zoonotic events more likely. And most experts agree that even more viruses and other pathogens will make the leap to us in the future, which is why there's widespread agreement that we have to get better at preparing for outbreaks in order to stop them from becoming pandemics before they start.
COVID-19 has claimed the lives of millions worldwide, and many who survived are still dealing with the long-term consequences, both physical and psychological. In our My COVID series, people tell us about their experiences with the virus. Today we're in Ghana's capital, Accra.
My name is Justice Lee Aduboy. I live in Accra, and I had COVID. In February 2021, I was diagnosed for typhoid, but the treatment was not, curing. I had a supposed typhoid, so I suspected it could be typhoid. So I went back to the hospital to get a request for the test, and then it was positive. But I had the symptoms of cough. That is the main symptom I had. And then at a point, my temperature went up. So those are the things I noticed that were strange. So I stayed for 4 days in the hospital. Initially, I saw the doctor, and then after that, my treatment was committed in the hands of the nurses. I don't remember any doctor coming back to me in the isolation, in the quarantine. But the nurses were overly caring. Nobody likes to be in isolation. So being in isolation, if you are not psychologically strong, that alone can make you break down. So I felt that feeling of, there is this thing in your system that is killing people, and you cannot predict what will happen tomorrow, and so on. That thing
makes me apprehensive. I may get, if I get COVID again, it will be a nuisance kind of to me, yes. If I said I didn't have that fear, I would be lying, because mine happened around the same time somebody who was also in the media died of COVID. So I had that fear. So friends said, but you, Justice, you were always in your mask, sometimes double mask, you were always washing your hand. How did you get it? So these are the same things I keep doing because hand washing has been part of me from childhood. It took me more than a month plus to recover, and I still sometimes feel the pain in my arm. So although I don't have symptoms from COVID, I have those reactions from the vaccination. I have seen people who got it and recovered. So I also believe that my faith in God will save me, even if I got COVID. And it did save me when I got it.
Japan's capital, Tokyo, is a major tourist draw. At least it was until 2020, when Japan's government closed its borders to the outside world. That was a blow to the millions of Japanese who made their living in the travel industry. Now, almost 3 years later, tourists are being welcomed back to Japan, a ray of hope for tour guides and others in the world's third largest economy.
Normally, this area of Tokyo would be bustling, and rickshaw drivers wouldn't have to wait for customers. The Sensoji Temple is at the top of most tourist lists when visiting Japan. But right now, most of the visitors are Japanese. Many shops are closed temporarily, and the souvenir sellers are only making a fraction of what they used to. Anyone living from tourism in Japan has had to make do with a lot less turnover since the pandemic. That includes Chad Fayan. The American offers bicycle tours of Tokyo.
There was always these promises that the borders would open up. The borders would open up. Oh, it's going to be next month. It's going to be in the fall. And so, okay, fine. I'm not going to get a real job. I'll keep, just plugging along so that when the borders open, we'll be ready to go for bicycle tours. But that never happened. And a year became 2 years. And then 2 years became 3 years. And here we are.
Chad enjoyed taking customers to Tokyo's more peaceful spots. One of the highlights of his tour, the Gotokuji Temple in the western part of the city. It's also known as the birthplace of the Maneki Neko. The lucky cats are world famous, a must-see, especially for young tourists in Tokyo.
So usually when I bring my guests here, this place is packed full of people. Not just cats, but lots of people are visiting this very famous temple. But as you can see, there's nobody here. It's just me.
But that could be about to change. Because from October 11th, Japan is dropping restrictions on individual visitors who are so vital to its tourism industry. They account for 85% of turnover in the sector. Since June, Japan has allowed groups of visitors on guided tours into the country. Toshiyuki Kaba leads French-speaking tourists around Enoshima Island. It's also home to a famous shrine. For a small donation, visitors here receive omikujis, little strips of paper that tell your fortune. So what does the tour guide see in his future?
As long as COVID-19 remains a threat, we have to be vigilant. And then we'd have to perhaps introduce further measures to protect ourselves.
People in Japan tend to be cautious when it comes to COVID-19. Masks are part of everyday life, and most people voluntarily wear them. Many question whether Japan will really see an onslaught of tourists when the restrictions end.
Keeping the borders closed for so long has actually hurt the tourism industry massively, and I don't think it's going to start up really fast right again.
Before the pandemic, tourism in Japan was booming, with record numbers of visitors. It's hard to say whether Americans, Australians, and Europeans will readily come to a country where people continue to be so cautious, a sign that the pandemic is still far from over.
That was this week's COVID-19 special. Next week, we'll be reporting about a vaccination that's needle-free. Scientists in India have great hopes for it. Join us for that and more. And until then, take care.